A small county jail interview room in Central Texas in the autumn of 1983. A thin, one-eyed drifter named Henry Lukas sits across a plain metal table from a detective. The detective slides an unsolved murder file across the table, opens it, and turns a photograph toward him. Lukas looks at the photograph for a moment, nods, and says quietly that yes, he did that one too. Over the next 2 years, Henry Lukas will confess to roughly 600 murders across America. Police detectives from 40 different states will fly to the small Texas jail to sit in this same chair. They will bring their oldest unsolved cases and lay the files in front of him one by one. They will close hundreds of those cases on his word alone. For 2 years, Henry Lukas is treated as the most prolific murderer in American history. He is given steak dinners, milkshakes, and a private cell in exchange for his confessions. He is driven around the country to point at fields and roadsides where he says he left bodies. Television crews follow the drives and broadcast his calm, matter-of-fact confessions. Then a Texas journalist begins to check the confessions against the calendar. He finds that on the day of one confessed murder in another state, Lukas was 1,000 miles away in Texas, cashing a paycheck. He finds the same impossible distance again and again. The Texas Attorney General opens an official inquiry into the confessions. The inquiry concludes that the great majority of them are simply not true. Henry Lukas had been telling detectives whatever they wanted to hear. He had been reading the case files they themselves left in front of him and feeding the details back. Each detective went home believing their case was solved. Whole squad rooms across the country marked their cold case boards as closed. The hundreds of cleared cases are quietly reopened, and most are never solved again. The real killers behind many of those murders had been left free the whole time. Some of them very likely went on to kill again. In the end, Henry Lukas is reliably linked to only 3 murders: his own mother, his young common-law companion, and an elderly landlady. And yet he is sentenced to death for one more killing of an unidentified woman known only as Orange Socks. It is the one murder that investigators later believe he almost certainly did not commit. In 1998, the governor of Texas commutes that death sentence, citing serious doubt. It is the only death sentence that governor ever commutes. Henry Lukas dies of natural causes in a Texas prison in 2001 at the age of 64. He leaves behind the single largest false confession scandal in the history of American policing. Henry Lukas is born in a tiny 2-room cabin near Blacksburg, Virginia in 1936. His childhood is one of the most disturbed ever recorded in an American court file. His mother, Viola Lukas, is a violent woman who beats him savagely from his earliest years. She forces him to watch terrible things and dresses him as a girl to send him to school. A childhood accident leaves him blind in one eye, and the eye is eventually replaced with glass. He is given almost no schooling and learns to survive by stealing food. He drifts into petty crime and burglary across the rural southern states as a teenager. He spends much of his early adulthood in and out of small jails and reformatories. In 1960, after a violent argument, Henry Lukas kills his mother, Viola. It is the first killing that can ever be reliably attributed to him. He is convicted and sent to a state prison for the killing. He tries to take his own life twice while inside. He is released early in 1970 because the prison is overcrowded. He tells the staff plainly that he is not ready to be let out. He warns them that he will do harm if they release him. They release him anyway. He drifts south and west, picking up work as a laborer and a roofer. By the late 1970s, he has reached the deep south of the United States. In Jacksonville, Florida, Henry Lukas meets another drifter named Otis Poole. The two men become inseparable traveling companions and small-time criminals. They drift across the southern states together doing odd jobs in petty theft. Otis Poole has a young niece named Becky Powers who travels with them. Becky Powers is a vulnerable teenager, and Lukas becomes her protector and companion. For a time, the group lives a rootless life of cheap motels and roadside diners. In the early 1980s, Lukas and Becky Powers settle in the tiny town of Stoneburg, Texas. They take work and lodging with an elderly woman who runs a small religious commune called the House of Prayer. The elderly woman, Frida Powers, gives them a roof in exchange for chores. For a short while, Henry Lukas has something close to a settled life. He works the fields, attends the chapel, and for once draws no suspicion. Then in 1982, Becky Powers disappears after an argument on a roadside. Lukas later tells investigators that she died during that argument. Soon afterwards, the elderly Frida Powers also disappears from Stoneburg. The small community begins to worry about the two missing women. The local sheriff starts to take a quiet interest in the one-eyed drifter. Lukas grows restless and leaves Stoneburg for a time. He is briefly jailed in another county for a minor offense and released. When he returns to the area, he is watched closely. In June 1983, he is arrested on a charge of illegally possessing a firearm. He is placed in a small cell in the Montague County Jail. It is in that cell that the strangest chapter of the case begins. After several days alone in the cell, Henry Lukas passes a note to the jailer. The note says that he has done some bad things and needs to talk. A Texas Ranger comes to the jail to listen to him. Lukas first confesses to the killing of the elderly Frida Powers. Then he confesses to the death of the young Becky Powers. He leads the investigators to scattered remains that confirm the two local killings. For the first time in his life, Henry Lukas is the center of serious attention. The detectives treat him with patience and even a kind of respect. They bring him coffee and cigarettes and listen to everything he says. For a man who had been ignored his whole life, the warm room and the listening faces are intoxicating. Lukas discovers that confessing makes the attention continue. He begins to hint that the two local killings were only the beginning. He tells the Texas Ranger that he has killed many other people in many other states. He says the number could be in the hundreds. He cannot read or write well, but he has a sharp memory for the details police reveal. He quickly learns which answers make the detectives lean forward and which make them frown. The Ranger writes it all down and passes the word to other departments. A national bulletin goes out describing a drifter who is confessing to killings in many states. Across the country, detectives with unsolved murders begin to take notice. A drifter who had crossed dozens of states was now claiming dozens of victims. To investigators sitting on cold, hopeless cases, it sounds like an answer. For some of them, it is a chance to finally close a case that has haunted them for years. The first detectives book their flights to Texas to question him. None of them know that the man waiting for them will simply agree to whatever they bring. A special task force is set up to manage the flood of visiting detectives. It is based at a small Texas jail and run by a local sheriff. Detectives from across the country are scheduled in, one after another, to question Lukas. Each one arrives carrying the file of an unsolved murder. They sit across the metal table and lay the file open in front of him. Without realizing it, they show him the crime scene photographs, the dates, and the locations. Lukas studies the details, waits a moment, and then confesses to the crime. He learns to give the detectives the small confirmations they are hoping for. When he gets a detail wrong, the detectives often correct him and move on. When he gets a detail right, it is recorded as proof of his guilt. The detectives are so relieved to hear yes that they rarely push him to prove it. In reality, every right detail had usually been sitting in the open file in front of him. The confessions are written up, and case after case is marked as solved. Detectives fly home and tell grieving families that the killer has finally been found. Henry Lukas becomes a national news story and a kind of grim celebrity. Magazines call him the most prolific murderer the country has ever produced. He is taken on long road trips in a car to point out where he says he killed. He is rewarded with restaurant meals, milkshakes, and special privileges. After years of being nobody, he has become the most important man in the building. The number of his confessed victims climbs past 100, then past 300. Eventually, the total reaches around 600 murders. Almost nobody in authority stops to test whether the confessions are physically possible. The few who raise doubts are told that the task force has it under control. A handful of detectives quietly fly home unconvinced, but say nothing in public. The case files keep closing, and everyone involved looks successful. A reporter for a Texas newspaper begins to look closely at the confessions. He starts with something simple, which is the calendar. He gathers Lukas's old work records, paycheck stubs, and receipts. He matches the dates of the confessed murders against where Lukas actually was. On the day of one confessed killing far away, the records show Lukas at work in Texas. On the day of another, a paycheck places him 1,000 miles from the crime. The reporter finds the same impossibility over and over again. A man cannot be in Florida and in Texas on the same afternoon. Yet both of those distant murders had been marked solved with his name on them. The newspaper publishes the findings and the story begins to turn. The Texas Attorney General opens a formal inquiry into the Lukas confessions. The inquiry gathers the travel records, the work records, and the confession transcripts. It concludes that the overwhelming majority of the confessions are false. Lukas himself then recants and says he never killed any of those distant victims at all. He says he only wanted to expose how willing the police were to believe him. The hundreds of solved cases collapse back into unsolved files. Detectives who had staked their reputations on the confessions are humiliated. Families who had been told their case was closed are told the opposite. The real killers in many of those cases had never been pursued. But by then, Lukas has already been sentenced to death for the Orange Socks murder. That conviction rests almost entirely on a confession the inquiry now doubts. There is no physical evidence tying him to the Orange Socks victim at all. In 1998, the governor of Texas commutes the death sentence to life in prison. That governor commutes no other death sentence before or after. Henry Lukas dies of heart failure in a Texas prison in 2001. He is reliably guilty of 3 murders and falsely credited with hundreds more. The true number of families he misled with a false confession may never be counted. The case is still taught to detectives as the clearest warning ever recorded. It is the warning that a confession on its own can be the weakest evidence of all. If you watch the last 2 episodes of this channel, you already know how this story rhymes. In 1988, a drifter who had terrified Los Angeles for over a year was caught not by the police, but by ordinary people on a street who recognized his face from the newspaper. In 1997, a law student on trial for murder represented himself, escaped from custody twice, and married a witness on the courtroom stand. Next episode, episode 21, we go inside the respectable suburban Chicago home of a married building contractor who performed at children's parties dressed as a clown and who was found to have buried 26 young men in the crawl space beneath his own floorboards.